In Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, we read that the sun, moon, and stars will be darkened immediately after the tribulation of those days. This great tribulation began in the year 1994, when the abomination of desolation was set up in the church, thus signifying that Satan's army had surrounded the camp of the saints. However, 2,300 days after the Great Tribulation began, God shortened that period by destroying Satan, the antichrist, in order to bring his elect out of the church. Now, in this study, we're going to discover that God used two other instances when the sun and moon were darkened to indicate that judgment had come up on two heathen kings, which represent Satan. The first being the Assyrian king, and the second being the king of Babylon. And we're going to learn that the reason God destroyed these heathen kings, which represent Satan, is to free them from captivity, which represents the fact that the true believers were taken captive while they were in the church during the Great Tribulation period. So let's first deal with the first instance of the sun being darkened. Now we're going to begin in Acts chapter 2, because this will point us back to the destruction of the Assyrian king in Joel chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, we read, "And I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord come." In other words, before judgment day comes, the sun and the moon is going to be darkened to indicate that God's judgment has come up on Satan, the antichrist, so that God could free his people from the church. Now, as I mentioned, the same language is found in Joel chapter 2. For example, in Joel chapter 2, verse 31, we read, "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered." Now we know from verse 20 that the deliverance is from the northern army, that is the Assyrians who took Israel captive. In verse 20 we read, "But I will remove far off from you the northern army, and will drive him into a barren land and desolate." So now we must keep in mind that when we read about the sun and the moon being darkened, it has to do with the fact that God is going to deliver us out of our captivity, out of the church. This idea is also articulated in Joel chapter 3, where we read about the darkening of the sun. For instance, in verse 1 of Joel chapter 3, we read, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land." Essentially, God is informing us that the Assyrians had sold the captives of Israel to the Grecians. And we know from Daniel chapter 8 that the Grecian is identified with Satan, the Antichrist. And this Antichrist took God's elect captive in the church for 2,300 days. Nevertheless, God is promising Israel that he will bring again the captivity. He will destroy or remove afar the northern army so that Israel could come back to its land of inheritance. And so, in Joel chapter 3, verse 15, we read that the sun and the moon shall be darkened and the stars shall withdraw their shining, as evidence that Israel will have the hope that they would be freed from captivity. And as we see in both Joel chapter 2 and 3, The blessing of this deliverance brings forth the latter rain, which produces corn, oil, and new wine, all representations of the gospel. And this gospel adjures God's elect to cry out to him, to call upon his name when we see that the sun and the moon have been darkened. Okay, so now the second instance of God darkening the sun and the moon and destroying Satan, the antichrist, is found in Isaiah chapter 13. Now, in this context, God is speaking about the king of Babylon. God used the Medes and the Persians to destroy the king of Babylon so that God's elect could come out of captivity and return to their inheritance in the land of Canaan. So let's turn to Isaiah chapter 13, beginning in verse 10, where we read about the darkening of the sun, moon, and the stars. For the stars of heaven and the constellation thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. In this context, God is saying that the Medes, as mentioned in verse 17, were going to be used to destroy Babylon. And we know that this actually occurred in 539 BC, when Belshazzar was destroyed by Darius in order to free the captives of Israel so that they could return to rebuild the temple. And we know that the rebuilding of the temple points to God's salvation. But that salvation could not come until God destroyed Satan the Antichrist, who is typified as the king of Babylon. So now when we go back to Matthew chapter 24, it all begins to make sense. For instance, in verse 16, God sets the stage by informing us that the Great Tribulation is typified as the time when we are to flee Judea into the mountains. This language is picked up in Luke chapter 21, where God uses the same language, but he says it is the time when Jerusalem is compassed by armies, namely the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who represent Satan the Antichrist. And this military conflict exemplifies what the Great Tribulation is all about. It is a spiritual war between God's elect and the false Christ and false prophets who come with signs and wonders in an attempt to deceive God's elect into following false doctrine. And it is at that time that the elect will be cast out of the church because they refuse to speak in tongues. They refuse to believe that we can become saved by accepting Jesus or being baptized in water. So for 2,300 days, they are persecuted in the church. And then immediately after the Great Tribulation, God destroyed Satan the Antichrist in order to free his elect from the captivity of the church. And that's why in Revelation chapter 18, he says, "Come out of Babylon." Okay, so once God's elect are delivered from the church, God begins to set the stage for his salvation program. The first aspect of that salvation program concerns the sign of the Son of Man in verse 30. Now we know from Matthew chapter 12 that the only sign that God is going to give this evil and adulterous generation is the sign of Jonah. And the sign of Jonah points to the fact that Christ was buried and resurrected. In other words, God is simply indicating that the sign of the Son of Man is the gospel as it goes into the world. God also alludes to this type of sign in Isaiah chapter 11, where it's referred to as an ensign. And this ensign is identified with the root of Jesse, who is also Christ. And it's also identified with the sign of Jonah, or the sign of the Son of Man. And that's precisely why God says that this ensign in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12, is used to gather God's elect who had been scattered in the four corners of the earth by the Babylonians. Now, this language is articulated back in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, where God says, "He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, And they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. God uses that same language in Jeremiah chapter 49 to describe the Elamites, who were also scattered into the four quarters of the earth. But in the last few verses of that chapter, God promises that he would bring again the captivity. And this is precisely why in Isaiah chapter 11, where we read about the ensign, that God says that the Elamites would be gathered from the four quarters of the earth. They would be gathered from Assyria, as we read in verse 11, and Shinar, which is also a picture of Babylon. And as we learned earlier, both of those places were ruled by kings who represent Satan. And in both cases, God darkened the sun and the moon and the stars in order to free his elect out of that captivity. And the mechanism by which God is going to free us out of captivity is articulated in Matthew chapter 24. It is the sign of the Son of Man, which represents the sign of Jonah, or the ensign that we read in Isaiah chapter 11. And it is the fact that God will send his angels, that is his messengers, who are the true believers, with the gospel into the four corners of the earth to gather together those who had been scattered during the Great Tribulation. Now, why does verse 30 of Matthew chapter 24 teach that the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds? Well, we know that the tribes refer to those in the churches. For instance, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, the word tribe is translated as the word kindred. There we read, "Behold, he cometh with the clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they which pierced him, and all kindreds," that's the word tribe, "of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, amen." So we see in both of these verses, the tribes are going to be mourning when they see the sign of the Son of Man, as well as those who pierced him, that is, those who crucified Christ. And we know from Hebrews chapter 6 that those in the church crucify Christ and put him to shame when they fall away from the true gospel. We find a similar admonition in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29. "Oh, how much sorer the punishment, suppose ye? Shall he be thought worthy who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace?" This is the punishment or the admonition that the tribes of the earth, namely the churches, will see when the sign of man appears after the Great Tribulation. In other words, as the gospel goes into the world, it's going to cause the world to mourn, as opposed to the time when they were rejoicing and having merry when the two witnesses were killed, because they were no longer being tormented by that true gospel in the church. But now, as the gospel is going forth, we find that any time we share the gospel with people in the church, they mourn, because they despise the idea that we can't become saved by accepting Jesus. But when we reject the true gospel, when we reject the fact that Christ only came to save his people, and we cannot come to him unless the Father draws him, when they reject that truth, it's like they're trotting underfoot the Son of God afresh. They're treating the Holy Covenant as an unholy thing. But wonderfully, every once in a while, we run across a believer like the one that is mentioned in Luke chapter 21, who is waiting for the redemption of Christ. In Luke chapter 21, verse 27, we read, "And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. These are the people who obeyed God's command to come out of the church. These are the people who are redeemed, who received that redemption through Christ's blood. They received forgiveness of sin. They weren't saved because they spoke in tongues, or they accepted Jesus, or they were baptized in water. They were saved by the faith and the work of Christ. They don't trust in their own works to become saved. And so, when Judgment Day comes, the redemption of their bodies will be completed, and they will be raptured to inherit the new heaven and the new earth. But sadly, those who were trusting in their own works for salvation will be destroyed when God destroys this present heaven and earth.